Good morning, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this roundtable on the future of Afghanistan. My name is Charles Powell, and I'm the director of the Elcano Royal Institute for International and Strategic Studies here in Madrid. I'm extremely honored and pleased to be able to introduce three excellent speakers who have very kindly agreed to join us at relatively short notice, because we thought it would be interesting to have a conversation about the future of Afghanistan from different perspectives. And I will introduce them very briefly, and then so that you know who they are, and so that you also have time to prepare your questions for them. Let me also take this opportunity to remind you that you can send your questions either via our Twitter feed, or you can send them to the email address actividades@rielcano.org. Either of those avenues will hopefully work. So first of all, we have with us Ambassador Aizaz Chaudhary, who is the director of the Institute of Strategic Studies in Islamabad. Good morning, Ambassador, and thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. In the interest of full disclosure, let me say that the ISSI recently invited me to join their academic advisory board, and I'm very honored to be associated with that institution. Ambassador Chaudhary is a former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan and Ambassador of Pakistan to the United States and the Netherlands. So we're very fortunate, I think, to have a very experienced Pakistani diplomat who has been observing the international scene for many decades now. And he will no doubt help us to shed some light on some of the geopolitical implications of the presence of a Taliban government in Afghanistan, which is our topic this morning, as you all know. Our second speaker today is Andrew Small, and he is a senior transatlantic fellow in the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And today he is joining us from Vienna. Thank you very much, Andrew, for being with us. And last, but by no means least, we have Lailuma Sadid, who is an Afghan journalist. And we thought it would be interesting, for obvious reasons, to have an Afghan voice in this debate. She, of course, is a very experienced journalist. She's currently based in Brussels, which is where she is joining us from. And of course, she will also be very keen to express her views on the domestic impact of the presence of a Taliban government in Afghanistan. But of course, as an Afghan, I would also encourage her, if she is willing, to speculate a little about how this new Afghan regime will operate internationally, given your knowledge, Lailuma, of the Taliban and how they operated in the past. Okay, so I will ask you to intervene now for approximately 10 minutes each. We have about an hour and 10 minutes, and I will come back to you with further observations and remarks as we go along. So, Ambassador, the microphone is yours, and thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Powell. Thank you, Elcano, for organizing this roundtable. The subject is geostrategic implications of a Taliban government in Afghanistan. I will like to dwell on three aspects of this topic. One is the role and responsibility of the United States and international community as a whole, the role and responsibility of the Afghans themselves, all inclusive Afghan factions, and finally, the role and responsibilities of the regional countries, particularly the neighbors of Afghanistan. So let me start with the first one. I think everyone is as surprised as United States perhaps was with the breakdown demise of the previous Afghan government in the wake of the US withdrawal of its troops, as well as the Afghan National Army also folded up rather quickly. So this defied all expectations. But does that mean that United States can now absolve itself of all responsibility? And I think not really, because United States came to Afghanistan for a very definitive objective, which was to eliminate Al-Qaeda and any other terrorist organization that had taken roots there and was using Afghan soil against the world as a whole. So that objective was achieved by and large in the first 8 to 9 years of the intervention by the United States. And thanks in no small measure to the help that Pakistan extended in eliminating Al-Qaeda. But then somewhere, somehow, the goalpost shifted, and the other concept of nation buildings came into the mainstream, and there were attempts to create governments in Afghanistan in the image of Western liberal democracy. And we saw in the last 1 month how unpopular or rootless was that kind of government which was installed. So now the United States is in a fix, because if it disengages completely from the situation, then the chances are that there will be no control of Afghan Taliban-led government in Afghanistan, and ungoverned spaces will start to expand. There will be a possibility of civil war again, country plunging into that, and that means that ground will be fertile for terrorist entities like ISIS, Daesh, and others to come back and take roots. That would probably mean that the very objective for which the United States went into Afghanistan in the first place in 2001 would have been defeated, and we will be back to the pre-2001 situation. And that is why it is important for the United States, as well as Europe and the rest of international community, to stay engaged with the Taliban government, and not with a view to accepting whatever they do or they don't do, but because you need to make Afghanistan a more peaceful and more stable place. And that's why engagement will be essential, especially by the United States of America. It cannot absolve itself of the entire responsibility and wash its hands off. The second point that I want to make is the role and responsibilities of the Afghans themselves. I think it is important for the Taliban government also to recognize that they would be better off only if they are able to fulfill some of the commitments that they had made, which enabled them in the first place to come to power. The agreement that Taliban had signed with the United States about 1.5 years ago in February of 2020 stipulates some of those commitments. I will mention only 4 of them, which I believe are important. One was that there should be, the Taliban wanted to declare amnesty for all, which probably they have. We don't see the kind of violence and bloodshed other than to administrative control of the area. And the second was that there was a commitment that Afghan soil will not be used again by terrorist entities against any other country. And I think here I would say that it would not be enough to give that guarantee only to the US or Europe. with regard to ISIS, Daesh, or Al-Qaeda. I think the regional countries too expect that the commitment by the Taliban would extend to other non-state actors and terrorist entities like Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and Balochistan Liberation Army, which in case of Pakistan was playing havoc with us using Afghan soil and using Afghan intelligence money and also India's intelligence money. And so for us, that is important. For China, it is ETIM. For Uzbekistan, it is IMU, and so on and so forth. I think that would be important commitment for the Taliban to keep. The third commitment that they had made was that they would like to carry everybody along. And that's why everybody is saying that you should have an inclusive government. Now, a case can be made that who has inclusive government? I mean, every country has those who have a directly elected governments, whether presidential or parliamentary. You don't force them to make coalitions. They do it by their own will. But in this case, I would say that Afghanistan is not really should be seen by the same yardstick as is for the Western liberal democracy models. I think Afghanistan has been governed in its own characteristic way, which was mostly decentralized, and therefore it makes sense for countries like the regional countries to send this advice to the Taliban that they should carry others along. There are other ethnicities like Uzbeks and Tajiks and Hazaras and even others. And so it makes sense for us to send advice. This is not to dictate terms. They will have to choose their own method, whether they do it by Loya Jirga or by the method they're already adopting. For example, 2 days ago, they did expand the cabinet and include many non-Pashtun representatives there, so which was a welcome step. The fourth commitment that the world and the region expects from them is with respect to human rights of the people, and particularly the women rights, because the women in Afghanistan need to have the right to study, to work, and to move around freely. And there is an expectation that the Taliban should honor all these commitments and should carry everybody along. In case they don't, my worry is that there could be hotspots emerging in different parts of Afghanistan, and we could have a specter of another civil war, which will not be good for Afghanistan, but it will also not be good for the region, because we have suffered enormously from the instability in Afghanistan. So therefore, I think Afghan leaders have a great responsibility that they must now give their nation a break and work and make it work this time. The third element that I wanted to speak of is what is it that the regional countries should do. Initially, there was an impression that was gathering that United States says, okay, we are off. This is a regional issue, a regional problem, let them solve it. And it's an Afghan problem, let them solve it. So I think that would also not be a good approach. And therefore, I started with the role and responsibility of the United States. But the region has a critical role to play. And here I'm mainly referring to the neighbors of Afghanistan and also the near neighbors. We have basically Pakistan, Iran, China, Russia, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Turkmenistan. These are the neighbors of Afghanistan who are directly affected. And we see a rare convergence of talking points in all countries of the region. They are speaking more or less with the same voice that they need a peaceful Afghanistan, that instability in Afghanistan hurts the region. All these mega schemes and even smaller schemes of connectivity between Central Asia and South Asia, between West Asia and South Asia, they're all depend on stability in Afghanistan. So there is a keenness in the region to see a stable Afghanistan. And to that end, they would, I think, would want the Taliban government to honor all those commitments, but at the same time, not allow the situation in Afghanistan to deteriorate further. What does that mean? That means that there is a humanitarian crisis, a human crisis which is looming to burst into proportions which are very dangerous. And I think that must not happen. It is important that humanitarian assistance is extended. I know that my country, Pakistan, is doing that. I know that some others are also have made commitments, but it is important that humanitarian assistance is kept out of the geopolitical considerations. The second aspect is that the Taliban would need assistance to run the government, technically and financially. Now, if they honor their commitments and the international community helps them to run an inclusive government, I think it will be a win-win. But in case the international community says, no, we will not let Taliban government survive, my worry is that we are surely heading to a situation where Afghanistan will descend into another civil war, and therefore a problem of huge proportions will be created, more so for the region, because we take the brunt of that. I think I would like to, I've done my 10 minutes. I think I would like to pause here and listen to Andrew and Lelua, and then of course we'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any. Back to you, Dr. Pavel.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that overview. You've raised a lot of interesting issues, and I'm sure that we can come back to some of those. In particular, of course, I think you mentioned a particularly interesting question, which is the fact that the Taliban have to prove not only to the United States, but to the rest of the world, and in particular to its neighbors, that they will not allow Afghanistan to be used as a base from which terrorist organizations will be free to operate in the future. And you pointed out that China, of course, was one of the many, was one of several countries that has an interest in that. So Andrew, perhaps this is one of the many issues that you can touch upon. Andrew Small is essentially a China hand, a very experienced China hand, but he knows the region very well, and perhaps he will want to enlarge some of his remarks. Thank you, Andrew. The microphone is yours.
Thanks very much, Dr. Bowen. Thanks very much to Elcano for the chance to join this discussion today. So I'm going to talk about two kind of broad areas. One is indeed China's direct policy response to what's happening in Afghanistan in the near to medium term. The other one is the kind of wider geopolitical dimensions of in particular China-US dynamics and where some of this sits. So some of this also reflects China's actual thinking about Afghanistan more broadly in its foreign policy, and really since the Soviet invasion, China's seen Afghanistan primarily through the prism of threats. And how to manage these threats. And they're threats of two kinds. One has been a geopolitical threat, the other has been a non-conventional threat. And when needed, China's taken quite an active role in trying to manage those threats directly. At other times, it's very intentionally limited its involvement. In the 1980s, of course, the geopolitical threat came from the Soviet Union, and China played a very active role in its support to the Mujahideen. In the 1990s, after kind of essentially opting out of involvement in Afghan affairs for a number of years, it stepped in towards the end to try and reach some kind of agreements with the Taliban, particularly focused on the role of Uyghur groups, ETIM, and their operations in the country. In the 2000s, on the one hand, for various reasons, the US invasion meant that China was relatively relieved about the removal of a government that, frankly, was still, despite some of the agreements they were able to reach, very uncomfortable with, but also saw a new geopolitical threat from the US presence in its back backyard, not just in Afghanistan itself, but the network of bases and facilities that eventually were established in the rest of the region. But then when the insurgency took off, when the Taliban insurgency took off at a later stage, this was then a situation in which, in one sense, China wanted neither side to win, neither the Taliban nor the United States. It spent a number of years pretty much sitting on its hands then again, opting out of active involvement. It continued to hedge its bets. It maintained active relations with the Taliban, even in their period in kind of exile, conducting a number of meetings, I think during a period even before a number of the other international actors were doing so. And then when it became clear that the US was on a long arc towards withdrawal, China stepped up its involvement again with a particular focus on the reconciliation talks and trying to get a peace process in motion. And so we saw for a number of years a view on the Chinese side that was quite clear in terms of the end state that it wanted to see, I think, in Afghanistan. It did not want to see the US withdraw in what China has deemed a hasty, risky withdrawal. They wanted to see this take place on a sort of conditions-linked basis. They wanted to see a political settlement reached with the Taliban before the US drew its forces down. They did not want, at the same time, to see the Taliban take power with an outright battlefield victory. They thought this was going to be leave the Taliban less likely even to pretend to have to moderate its position, to reach compromises with other political forces inside the country, and to reach compromises with the international community. And of course, the risk that this would have an inspirational effect on militancy across the region. And the US presence, in a certain sense, acted to some extent as a geopolitical benefit for China too. The concern that China has now is that this is kind of the end of an arc that many there have seen as a sort of long window of opportunity pretty much since 2001, that with the United States bogged down in continental Asia, focused on counterinsurgency or counterterrorism or a whole series of the other missions and responsibilities that it took in the greater Middle East and Afghanistan, rather than having the resources and time to focus on the theaters that China tends to see as its primary ones, the maritime space, Indo-Pacific, great power competition, that this has now created the space and bandwidth for the United States to focus on what it now sees as its primary target, which is China itself. And the concern as well on China's part has been that it will be sucked in to the situation at just the moment the United States moves out. If you look at a lot of the Chinese commentary on this, there are many who see Afghanistan through the prism of being a sort of trap. Of course, there is this obsessive focus on graveyard of empires and these sorts of things, but there's more complex analysis as well about the risks that are posed of certain levels of depth of political, economic, let alone military involvement there. So China does also, and for a number of years, there's also been the concern about being trapped into deeper involvement there. But China knows it needs, in this context, to take on a more active role. We've seen that already diplomatically in the aftermath of the Taliban coming to power, and even before that, including the very highly publicized visit from Mullah Baradar to Tianjin, in the most kind of public and visible reception that the Taliban leadership have received on the Chinese side with in their meeting with Wang Yi. In principle, China is, over the longer term, interested in taking on a more active economic role, but going back to this principle of threat management, if it comes down to it, China can minimize its involvement again. And there are a lot of conditions that I think would be required for China to take on the sort of scale of economic presence that could really make a determinative difference to the economic picture in Afghanistan, and a number of factors that will really have a significant effect on the quality of relations that China has with the Taliban, notwithstanding the fact that they have maintained good, cordial ties with them for a considerable period of time. The primary issues do relate still to Taliban's relations with various transnational militant groups. Top of China's list, of course, is the group that they call ETIM, going by the name of its UN designation. The group calls itself TIP. There's always been top of the agenda in China's dealings with the Taliban, going back to exchanges with Mullah Omar and back during the Taliban's last time in government. The same guarantees have been made by the Taliban to China, but China's never been really sure what they will translate into on the ground, how far they go, what sort of limitations there will actually be on the activities of various of these groups. So this is still a big question mark for China, but it doesn't just include the kind of classic focus that China's had on TIP, ETIM. In the more recent period, some of the groups that Ambassador Chaudhary mentioned, in particular the TTP, have been a greater source of concern to China. In the end, if it comes down to it, China doesn't have to take on a particularly significant economic role in Afghanistan or physical presence in Afghanistan, but it does have considerable scales of investment personnel in the wider region who are seen to be on the Chinese side soft targets. There have been concern in particular about some of the developments that we've seen in Pakistan relating to CPEC in the last few months, including one of the attacks in particular that took place in Dasu. But beyond that, China does not want to see a destabilizing impact on the wider region and the countries that are, for China, much greater of much greater importance, frankly, Central Asian states and Pakistan. The other element for China, before it would take on any more serious economic role, it just relates to the capacity for the Taliban really to control security in Afghanistan and its capacity to achieve some level of political stability there. This does not just relate to kind of short-term guarantees that the Taliban can offer, security promises and things. Any serious natural resource projects in Afghanistan will take a considerable length of time before they yield real returns for the Chinese companies. So the Chinese need a framework there that will stick. Some level of kind of illusory temporary control that then unravels is not going to serve Chinese interests. They've seen that happen before. They don't want to see a situation either where the Taliban fractures or resistance to the Taliban builds, and you end up back in as Ambassador Chaudhary mentioned, a civil war scenario, or even some kind of lower level counterinsurgency attacks on projects and things. And for China, the concern is that even when they get a lot of the critical political forces on board there, the risks and threats to projects there are quite multifarious. Foreign intelligence services, unhappy local actors with access to weapons, unhappy factions within the Taliban. This is a kind of complex picture before China's really able to have confidence in the security conditions for its larger scale investments in the country. And finally, it makes life difficult for Chinese companies if there are serious terrorism sanctions in place from the United States and Europe. And of course, it creates real problems for China if Afghanistan is in an economic mess. So they do want the Taliban to jump through a number of these kind of almost acceptability hoops in order to win some level of recognition from the international community, even if some of the issues are not ones that they care about intrinsically. Some of them they care about for the sake of political stability and the security in the country, but there are other issues that they know will make a difference to the Taliban's international reception, at least. So in the short term, I think we see, of course, China maintaining ties with the Taliban in a good spirit, but also trying to put a certain amount of pressure on them on this kind of list of what are almost a set of demands or preconditions around terrorism, the inclusiveness of government, all of the sorts of things that we saw in any of the speeches from Wang Yi and Xi Jinping at the recent SCO summit. I think we see China, of course, coordinating particularly closely with the regional powers when it comes to all of this. Ambassador Chaudhary mentioned a long list of them. I think the two most important in some respects are Pakistan, which China still relies on very heavily in navigating this. This is not a comfort zone for China still. This is not Myanmar. This is not North Korea. China still needs Pakistan's assistance in making judgment calls, both with respect to the Taliban and to a number of wider dimensions in Afghan politics. And on the international side, China is now able to operate much more closely with Russia than was the case historically in dealing with the situation. And we've seen that already at the UN Security Council. I think China wants to leave on the table the prospect of a much bigger economic relationship and the prospect of much more significant investment ties, BRI commitments, mineral investments, and things like this, as an incentive if the Taliban do actually deliver on the things that China is insisting on. But I think as we're seeing, China's operating very cautiously in the near term. We'd expect that what we've already seen, which is some level of modest humanitarian aid, can be somewhat expanded. We could see certain levels of financial assistance being provided. And I think we could see some kind of modest projects that can be kind of better protected, that yield returns in a shorter period of time, partly as a kind of taster for what might be possible in the longer term if the right conditions are met in the country. If the Taliban fail to deliver on the areas that China is most concerned about, transnational militancy, security conditions in the country, a political settlement that China thinks is going to stick, I think the relationship will remain cordial, channels will remain open, some economic relations will persist, talks will go on, but China will go back to its focus on threat containment and some degree of limitation of its involvement. We see even now the level of focus that China still has on issues around cross-border threats. For instance, we've seen the exercises that China's conducted with Russia in Central Asia. The direct cross-border threats to Xinjiang are extremely minimal, but it's nonetheless something that China, of course, has an eye on. But I think when it comes down to it, China sees a lot of these as threats that can ultimately be managed. I don't think it's happy about the situation that it's seeing evolving in the region. Right now, I think it has a lot of concerns and uncertainties, but I think it sees them as potentially risks that can be contained. The bigger risk, as I say, that China sees, and the thing that I think it will not do is treat Afghanistan as a quote-unquote vacuum that it then rushes into on a large scale. I still think this, in terms of the calculus and the way that China looks at Afghanistan, and the wider prism of what China sees as its geopolitical priorities, I think it's highly unlikely that this is going to happen. And I'll wrap up there.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for bringing the Chinese dimension so sharply into perspective, and also for establishing links with other regional partners, Pakistan most prominently among them. We're very fortunate to have with us, as I said earlier, an Afghan journalist, an experienced Afghan journalist, and of course, Lailuma, the fact that you are in Brussels and not in Kabul in itself speaks volumes, right? I'm sure you would much rather be at home and not in Brussels, lovely city though it is. So please give us your take on what is going on in your country. Andrew very briefly mentioned the fact that, of course, the economy is in an absolute mess, and this is a dimension that we shouldn't forget. But prior to that, of course, the big question is, do you think the Taliban can really govern? And perhaps related to that, what do you think of this notion that this is a new kind of Taliban regime compared to the previous experience? As you well know, many commentators are underscoring this idea that the Taliban have become more sophisticated, they are more cosmopolitan now, they are more aware of the external limits and the context in which they operate. Do you think this is true, or is this just wishful thinking? Over to you. The microphone is yours. Thank you, Lailuma, so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and speakers and distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share with you my views and experience as a journalist and as a young woman during the war, and especially during this time under the Taliban regime. The period was just a nightmare, and I still see the same situation, especially for women in Afghanistan. What is happening in Afghanistan now, it's a disaster, a catastrophe, and a tragedy, especially for women, which I see it in my country. Because the Taliban is still, in my mind, this is the same Taliban. The burqa or hijab, whatever Taliban want to impose to women in this terrible time, only repeated their need for dimension, their fear of failure. And since the beginning, they have been using religious as an excuse to impose their decision. I was very young when the Taliban took power, let's say in Afghanistan. They whipped me because I was teaching girls. They were beating me because I didn't cover my face. They beaten hundreds of girls like me who were fighting for their rights. Tell me, is that a crime to study as a woman? I think the time has come back and make of justice, equality, freedom, and liberty a reality for a woman in Afghanistan. We fight for our rights and freedom and against discrimination. We will fight until we get our rights, and we will never give up. We are suffering as a woman a lot during the war in Afghanistan. And I don't see any change in Taliban. They will never change. That is the change. You saw it. The same flag, the same rule, the same ideology, the same name. They are beating more and more. They are violated, they are killing without any judgment. They want girls going to school or women to study or work. Is that a change? Even we are not allowed to choose our color of dress. Is that a change? 25 years ago, Taliban did not allow us to listen in the music, going out without any man. And still, this is the same. Is that a change? From which side should I talk? They are changing. I think they are not change and never change. The spokesperson of the Taliban in the first press conference, he said, we will continue and follow our ideology. It's clear. They are following the strong rule of Sharia. Is that a change? They have the list of the biometric. They are searching house by house. Find the women and activists who work for a media, who work for the police and army, who are journalists, lawyer, and doesn't matter, they are working. They are taking, they are betting, they are killing. Is that a change? To be honest, for me, Taliban is the same and they will not change and never change. A lot of things happen in the provinces and no one is covering. I have a contact with a lot of journalists and activists in Afghanistan, and they are crying and they said, why word is quiet? Why they are silent? Why they are not look at us? Afghanistan is not the same Afghanistan like before. 20 years, it's a big change. And how we accept that Taliban is change? Taliban couldn't cut their relation with Al-Qaeda, with Haqqani network, and any other terrorist group in Afghanistan. The Secretary General of NATO and the same US high level, few times in their press conference here in Brussels, they said there is 20 terrorist groups, including Al-Qaeda and Haqqani network and any other terrorist group active in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So where they are now? We know that. They are still in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And this is a problem, not only for Afghanistan, it's a problem for people of Pakistan and for the world. And I hope world understand that and keep open their eyes and follow everything. And also, I'm sorry to say that, Ambassador, but ISI should not intervene in Afghanistan. We are a free and independent country. As you know that, powerful countries defeated in Afghanistan, and it doesn't work at all with anyone in Afghanistan, including ISIS. As I always said, the peace agreement, and also Ambassador mentioned that, for me, the peace agreement, which is signed by Taliban and Ambassador Khalilzad, was a wrong policy because they legitimized the terrorist group of Taliban and bring them in the negotiation table. It was wrong policy because on that agreement, I couldn't see myself. There wasn't any voice of Afghan citizens or any Afghan politician. It was wrong and felt like that. And we know Mr. Khalilzad was the lobbyist in favor of an oil pipeline throughout Afghanistan when the Taliban were last in power. So that's clear. They are fighting for that. And they replace Taliban by Taliban. 20 years. Where is the achievement? They spent thousands of billions in Afghanistan, thousands of soldiers, international soldiers killed and wounded in Afghanistan. The same for the Afghan citizens. We are suffering a lot. And if you look at now, in 20 years, what is the achievement? And for that, I am sure that I would like to ask and request for the world, as I did always to everyone here at NATO and also the European Union. Please don't recognize the Taliban because they are still the same ideology and they never change. They are catastrophe and they make the world again in disaster. We are going back in a civil war if it continues like that. We saw the cabinet they established. More than 70 people of the cabinet, they are still the people they are in the blacklist of the United Nations. How does we accept? With the terrorist group, we have our cabinet and they are in the lead. They are not accepting any woman going to a school, and they said the woman stay for the moment. But as woman, I have this experience. During the past, they only allowed the doctors that they doesn't want me going by man to have a medical checkup. And they are allowing few journalists in Kabul because they also knows for the moment the world is watching them. Is that a change? From which point should I say that Taliban change? And how I accept that Taliban change? Few days ago, they killed 2 women in Herat province. Why media couldn't say anything? Because they are controlling them. Few days ago, they whipped women in Jalalabad, and why there is no word about them in the media? Because they are controlling them. The same, they killed a woman who worked with the army in front of their family in Orzagan province, and they said she worked with the army. Is that a crime? From which way should I talk? And word is always, like always, following the wrong policy which is established by United States from few specific people. They have seen their benefit on that. And I would like that Europe, at least this time, learn from their mistake and they support the people of Afghanistan. For the moment, we saw the humanitarian support for Afghans, and this is a good point. But how we trust that this support going directly to the hand of the people who need it, and not again going to the hand of the terrorist group like Taliban. I never said they are a regime, and for me, Taliban is always the terrorist group because they couldn't cut their relation, and 20 years, they fight against the government. They fight against democracy. They fight against freedom. And now we say that give a chance for them. 20 years was a long period for them if they want to show for the world that we change. 2 months before they took power in Afghanistan, they killed thousands of people who were in universities, school, teachers, professors, activists, and all these kind of things. Even they did an organized attack in a school. And now, how do I believe that the Taliban change? And for me, this is something always in my mind. A terrorist group, they already mentioned it very clear. We are following our ideology. So how do I accept that they are changed? As a Muslim woman, my Islam doesn't say that women stay at home and not studying. We are equal. And they said we are free and we are educated the same. But I don't understand Taliban following which Islam, the Sharia they want, and that's not something we really wanted. Democracy, ambassador said in Afghanistan, that's true. But 20 years, we born and grew up with democracy. And now we don't want to lose that. Even for me, if they kill me by name of democracy, I will proud, but I never stay quiet and silent, and I will always fight for our rights. And I hope in this that the world, especially the European Union, support us. We are women, we are human, at least they respect us. And they gave us a chance. We said we want a study, work, and education because there is thousands of million families in Afghanistan. They don't have their own man. During this 40 years war, they lose the man of their family. What they should do? And for this, once again, I know the people of Pakistan is also like Afghan population, the victim of this war. But we shouldn't try the wrong policy. Sometimes we think for their citizens. And I hope this message give everyone that they think about that and they listen this time for the decision of the Afghan people and accept that. And they talked about the government that the coalition government. That's something like in the past also we had a coalition government and doesn't work really very well. For me, it's the most important we have the real person who is working and who have the ability to work honestly for the Afghan and not for themselves. And also because Andre also mentioned it about the geopolitical location of Afghanistan. Unfortunately, that's true. Everyone is trying to have their benefit and using Afghanistan against the other countries. And I hope this time, no one is using Afghanistan as a safe even for the terrorist group and doing some terrorist attacks they did in the past for the other countries.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Naguma.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your experiences, your views, and your outrage, which, of course, is absolutely understandable. And we wish you all the best, of course. Ambassador, I've got a few questions coming in for all of you. We have about 130 people listening in from all over the world. Two things in particular, Ambassador, if I may. First of all, a number of people are asking us, some people are surprised that you seem to have described Pakistan as rather a sort of distant observer to some extent of what's going on the ground. And you are suggesting effectively that Pakistan is not terribly influential and does not really have the ability to influence, let alone control the Taliban. So I'm getting this is not my question, these are questions that are coming in. How influential is Pakistan really? And of course, there are several questions here about the so-called Pakistani deep state, your intelligence services. Did they see this coming? Were they as surprised as the intelligence community elsewhere in Europe, perhaps, and in the United States? And the second question, Ambassador, I would like you to address is engagement. You have argued very, I think, convincingly, in fact, that we need to engage. But the question, of course, is how do you engage with a regime or a government such as this? You differentiated between providing humanitarian aid, which of course we are all doing, and the day after, in other words, structural, long-term, technical and financial assistance. So how can we engage with this new government, and precisely on what terms? In other words, what kind of conditionality? This is the key word, I guess. What kind of conditionality should we attempt to enforce? Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Sure. I'll be very happy to address this array of questions as well as some points raised by the previous speaker. Pakistan is not a distant observer. Pakistan has been affected the most from the instability in Afghanistan for the last 40 years. I'm not saying 20 years, I'm saying 40 years. We have been hosting more than 3 million Afghan refugees for 40 years. 80,000 people cross border every day, either way. We are not a distant observer. We have suffered. We have suffered 80,000 of our lives and $150 billion worth of economic losses. And all because Afghan soil was being used against Pakistan by the TTP and BLA, which were supported by the Afghan intelligence, NDS, along with India. So President Ashraf Ghani's government had given huge space to India for all those 7 years to create havoc in Pakistan. Now, is that a democratic order? Is that a democracy that you should use your soil for allowing another country to settle its scores with your neighbor? We were hurt. So therefore, we were not a distant observer. We were the victim. Now, as for whether Pakistani intelligence agency was involved, let me tell you, I want to tell you that even during the peak of the insurgency in Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban were in Afghanistan. The bulk of their cadre was in Afghanistan. It's wrong to say that some people who come and meet their relatives in refugee camps are able to convene all that military strategy and then go and implement it. No, they can't. All this exaggeration of Quetta Shura and Karachi Shura and Miran Shah Shura and that was actually an exaggeration, an aberration that was created by the governments in Afghanistan that you call as democratic governments to sustain power. The lady said that the Europe should now support the people of Afghanistan. Excuse me? If the people of Afghanistan were so hurt by the departure of Ashraf Ghani, why didn't they stand up to Taliban? Why didn't that 300,000 army stand up to Afghanistan, to Taliban? Why was this transition and transfer so peaceful? In fact, the people of Pakistan, people of Afghanistan were perhaps finding more security with the Taliban than with the Afghan government at that time. Even if you see, and I remember I met over 60 US legislators one-on-one, and I was telling them that you have created a body called SIGAR, Senior Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction, and read their reports. They were constantly pleading that 44% of Afghan territory is not under the control of Afghan government, and that all those terrorist entities were there. Why would Afghan Taliban need Pakistan's territory if they had 44% of such a large territory available to them? So I think this whole narrative that had been built by the previous government and which has been repeated by Ms. Leluma also, was a deception, a self-deception, an exercise in self-deception, that blame it on Pakistan, scapegoat Pakistan, and absolve yourself of this responsibility. That is what has led it to. You remember when the Taliban and US had a deal, one of the primary clause was to have intra-Afghan talks. What happened? President Ashraf Ghani dragged his foot time and again, until it was time for the US troops to leave. And you see how quickly everything folded up. Why didn't the Afghan governments of that time believe in the intra-Afghan talks? Because if you treat the Afghan Taliban as somebody outsider and you want to have only yourself as the ruler, exclusive ruler of Afghanistan, naturally that zero-sum approach will not work. And that is why we believe that while the world is telling the Taliban to accommodate everybody, the others should also step forward to now make their country more peaceful. And if you are thinking that there'll be more sanctions on Taliban and more conditionalities attached to the Taliban to change their behavior, I am afraid you are pushing the country back to civil war again. I have no brief for the Taliban. I have said it very, very clearly that the TTP is our enemy. And if they share any ideology with TTA, that's something that they have to answer about. But at the same time, there is a reality, there is a ground reality now in Afghanistan. You got to deal with it. And if the world thinks that you can once again isolate them, then my worry is that the all that money, trillions of dollars spent and 2,400 American lives, and I don't have the figure about the NATO lives, are all gone to waste. Only to get this. Now, whether the Taliban have changed from the late 90s or not, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. That is why proof of the pudding is in eating it, which means that we expect them to honor those commitments. But we do see the signs that they are ready to work. The lady said that what has changed? I can point out 20 things which have changed. And there are so many journalists who are sending every day reports from Kabul, who are saying the life has gone back to normal, but for the economic crunch that they are facing. So placing the blame on Pakistan and Pakistan's intelligence agency has something which has not worked. Don't do that again, because it won't solve anything. It is not a reality. We have spent precious money of ours to fence the border. We don't want cross-border movement of terrorists or militants. And I think it is important that this narrative is jettisoned once for all. It has not worked and it will not work. And if you bring back a puppet government, which is hardly a representative government, you will see that same thing will happen what has happened now. So I think that's why I'm saying the region has a role to play. Perhaps Europe and America do not suffer except on some terrorists going there or refugees flowing out there. But we suffer from a whole lot else too, not just these refugees and terrorists. We suffer enormously in every way. And that's why I think the scapegoating should stop. The people of Afghanistan have suffered enough. Don't the people of Afghanistan and their leaders, especially those living in the Western world, should think of their country and live and let live philosophy should be formulated. And they should join hands. Now there is an amnesty. People said this will not be declared, there'll be violence. Nobody saw that violence. Amnesty was there. That is the change. We also see that they are continuing to say that we will not allow the terrorist sentences. We will wait, but it's a good step. So my sense is that it would be important for the world to stay engaged in a positive way, not to allow the humanitarian crisis to develop into huge proportions, and not to allow the dispensation to fall because you want to have economic coercion as an instrument of policy or conditionality as an instrument of policy. I think once they are able to respond to you on all these commitments, then I think that's the way to go. I don't find fault with Ambassador Khalilzad's agreement with the Taliban. I don't think that was Ambassador Khalilzad's agreement. I think he was doing it on behalf of the United States of America. I think the US owned that agreement. And it was pursuant to that agreement that the United States withdrew its troops. Therefore, I think it will be wrong. In fact, many of the clauses of that agreement should have been implemented, including intra-Afghan talks, including the steps to delist the Taliban. Those have not been honored, but the Taliban should be forthcoming. And I say that because I demand from them as much as you do that they should honor their commitments. And only then they'll get all those recognition. But to ostracize them, to isolate them, to impose conditionalities and economic sanctions on them, to get your way, I think we are not being fair to the people of Afghanistan because we'll be plunging the country back to square one. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. Andrew, very quickly, and Lailuma, of course, you will have the last word today. Engagement, Andrew. Of course, China is a very, very sophisticated international player, although perhaps isn't always recognized in Europe and the US sufficiently. There is such a thing as Chinese soft power, and it is quite effective in many ways. So how do you think, you gave us a very good description of how pragmatic and hard-nosed the Chinese will be. But when it comes to trying to define modes of engagement, do you think there will be a specifically Chinese modality of engagement? Do you think, for example, that we in the EU should observe Chinese efforts more closely than we have in the past in this regard? Thank you.
I mean, China has a couple of advantages insofar as there are certain forms, although they have their forms of conditionality as well, they've made clear that there are certain conditions that would be required for them to be involved in a certain way economically, and even to a certain extent some of the questions around recognition at the moment. I mean, the thresholds that are being put in place that the Chinese and others are suggesting that should be in place for a Taliban government, the bar is not very high, in fact, by way of the standards of expectation from any state. There are a whole series of conditions that China is indeed relatively indifferent to. It is far more indifferent to and has no kind of perception of a moral commitment to human rights, democratic structures, any of these sorts of things. And so it will treat these matters, again, except insofar as they also do not want to take economic responsibility for the country. I mean, there is a huge push at the moment to put the onus on the West still to provide certain forms of economic support. China does not do large-scale aid. It does investment. It does humanitarian aid. It does small-scale support. The problem, of course, is going back to the economic situation in the country. Before one goes into questions around central bank assets and things that will probably be navigated, but simply looking at how a government there is able to sustain itself, it's been very aid dependent for a considerable period of time. The economic investments that would be required to generate real revenue for the government are some way off being able to be delivered. So and there are certain forms of revenue generation that China as well would find rather problematic. We've seen how the Taliban were able to finance their own operations in the last period of time. So there are a lot of concerns that even China has in terms of, again, I mean, the commitments when it comes to transnational terrorism. At the moment, it's not at all clear that the government, a Taliban-led government, will fulfill them in a way that China would find fully acceptable. They didn't in the past. There are still concerns that in terms of the constellation of forces that we're seeing emerging, in terms of the relative factional balances within the Taliban, we're not even seeing the people that China is most comfortable with assuming an ascendancy there. So there's still a lot of questions, even when we go to the really minimal standards that I think one would expect a state to meet in terms of its international commitments. And that, I mean, and I say even for China, which will not insist on some of the other preconditions, I think there are still some real concerns there. And their conditions, there are things that China will do anyway. They will maintain certain sorts of ties. I mean, a number of Western states have maintained similar sorts of ties with the Taliban. China has additional advantages. Pakistan does have a particular kind of relationship with the Taliban. China's close relationship with Pakistan means that it is afforded certain sorts of linkages and contacts, and they hope, and I speak to plenty of people on the Chinese side, they hope that Pakistan is able to use its influence and in some cases capacity for pressure to nudge the Taliban towards fulfilling some commitments that China cares about in particular. And again, these are not necessarily the same commitments that the West cares about. And so there are some advantages that China has in that regard, given its special relationship and friendship with Pakistan. But China is also uncomfortable, has always been uncomfortable with the Taliban as well. Going back to Taliban going to China at the time when they're blowing up the Bamiyan Buddhas and having all of their meetings cut off and things, they still find this ideologically a problematic government. They're prepared to deal with them pragmatically. But even there are some limitations and concerns. China will also not want to see them isolated. China will also want to make sure that there's an economic floor put under the government there. China will also want to ensure that they're not squeezed by sanctions. But I think even then, they know that there are certain things that the Taliban needs to go, that are minimal conditions that still need to be reached if they're going to put themselves on a certain footing internationally that can involve certain sorts of international engagement. They're different conditions, but there are still some conditions that I think even the Chinese have, and that they're concerned, I think, right now as to whether these are going to be fulfilled. So I don't think yet the model that China has on this in terms of the relations with the Taliban, some of these are not replicable by anyone else, nor necessarily something that should be replicated. But China is going to be an important interlocutor as well. I mean, this is one of the reasons that Khalil Saad used to go through Beijing sometimes more often than he'd go through certain allied countries. China has its own channels. China has its capacity for influence there. And I think people are going to be looking to the Chinese position on some of these things. And ultimately, it will be China, if the conditions are in place, the economic support that China can provide in principle is going to be important. And that is a form of conditionality that is there on the Chinese side. I think one would hope will have some influence, because if even China will not swing in economically, then we have the Taliban government is going to have real problems, because the West is not going to come in with certain forms of economic support in the way that they did in the past.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Andrew. Lailuma, we have 6 or 7 minutes, and obviously I would like you to express, to answer the ambassador as you see fit. But before you do so, there are a lot of questions coming in directed at you. One of them is, there are two really. First of all, what is your prediction in terms of what is going to happen now? If as we have been discussing, neither the US nor the European Union nor the Chinese are going to be terribly actively engaged on the ground. Presumably, the situation in Afghanistan will now be determined by Afghan society, by internal Afghan forces, or the struggle within Afghan society. So one question I have for you is, do you think civil war is inevitable? Or do you think, since the Taliban have the monopoly of force, of the use of force, they are well equipped, and they are therefore, and obviously not shy about repressing dissidents. We've seen that in recent days and weeks. Do you think, therefore, that there are two possible options, right? One is stability under a relatively repressive, or more or less repressive Taliban regime, or some kind of civil war, which of course would probably attract outside players sooner rather than later. And secondly, I have questions from people who would like you to answer something very specific, which is it possible, although, as you said, people are being murdered, people who were associated with the previous administration are suffering, but do you think that gradually the Taliban will have to accept a certain amount of personal freedom for example, highly trained, highly qualified individuals? You mentioned female doctors earlier. Because the society has changed and the infrastructure has changed. Afghanistan today is a much more modern, sophisticated country than it was when the Russians invaded in 1979. So very briefly, we only have about 5 minutes, and then I'm afraid we have to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a lot of good questions. 5 minutes will be too short to answer, but I would make very short as much as I can. Let me start by that civil war, which is, as a woman, we are always afraid. And when I talked with the people inside in Afghanistan, they think soon or late will be a start if it continues like that. Because Taliban put more pressure on Afghan population. Doesn't matter from which ethnic group they are, from which religions they believe. And they put more pressure on them. And as you mentioned it, Afghanistan is not the same Afghanistan 25 years ago. And that's why I said we smell the feel of the democracy in our country. And we are never trying to go back. We always trying to go forward. And from that, which way we will continue to go forward, doesn't matter. And second point about the amnesty. When you look at in the provinces, in other cities in Afghanistan, where is that amnesty? There is a lot of international media covered the genocide from Panjshir, from Baghlan, from Jalalabad, from Badakhshan, and also the other area we don't have any contact with the journalists. We never know what is going on. And this kind of pressure and hard rule put the people to stay and fight for their life, and then the civil war will start. And second, the support of the countries, especially the neighboring countries from Afghanistan, from China, Pakistan, Iran, India, Russia, or some other countries in the world. It put us in the way that we are going in the civil war, and I am afraid for the dark future very soon. And about the point, if I mention it, Ambassador talked about the Shorai Kuvita and also Miram Shah, and they said it's exaggerating. Not at all, I think, because the Taliban were born from that areas and they came to Afghanistan with the support of some terrorist group, which is really also against the people of Pakistan, let's say. As I said before, people of Pakistan suffered and victim, and also Afghan people also victim of this war. So if there is no support, look at the Osama bin Laden, from where and how he was killed, if we think that there is no connection. From that also, if I mention it about the intelligence between Afghanistan and Pakistan, during the President Ghani, they signed an agreement sharing information by intelligence service between Pakistan and Afghanistan. If there is not good relation, how do we believe that they are signing this very important agreement on that? The other point, if I mention it, if I allow that, the US also involved in this, all this kind of things, because let's say the commander of the military action, let's say, responsible for outcome of today's. And also, they support the corrupt government. And this is the point that we always talk, especially when I talked in Europe, I said, listen, you are supporting the corrupt government. Change their policy. It is not good. You are supporting the corrupt government, but when you go in Afghanistan to ask for the civil or activists, they are not agree with these things happen in Afghanistan. So United States, Afghan government, and also Pakistan. I mean, when I say Pakistan, I'm not talking about the people of Pakistan. I'm talking about the ISI. And they're always supporting this kind of things. And then we saw the outcome. If I answered this question, all good, because I see that we are run away from the time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Lailuma. Thank you all. Let me thank the three of you, first of all, for your very interesting contributions. And I hope we can all stay in touch and continue to analyze this fascinating and also deeply worrying situation in the months ahead. Let me also thank the 120, 130 people who have been following us from different regions of the world, Europe, the United States, Latin America, Asia. And finally, of course, let me apologize, as I often have to do, for not having been able to collect all of your questions. There were lots of very interesting questions covering a very broad array of issues, and I hope we can come back to many of these in future sessions. So thank you all for your participation.
One small point, if I mention it about the humanitarian support for the Afghan people, please don't forget the people of Afghanistan. There is a lot of international NGOs in Afghanistan and also out of Afghanistan. Please try to support them because they are suffering a lot and too much.
Thank you very much for that reminder. I think we can all agree that international aid, humanitarian aid, will remain a crucial factor in this conflict in the months and probably, sadly, the years to come. So thank you all very much and have a wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye now.
Thank you, Elcano. Thank you, Dr. Powell. It was a good discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. Take care. Goodbye, Lailuma. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bueno, Manen, tú siempre dices que aquí no hay debate.